it's Mo. Today I wasn't sure what video I wanted to post for Bookmas, but I thought that I would post a video where I go through all the books that I've read this year that have made me cry. This year is the first year that I have had a Storygraph. You can watch a video where I created my Storygraph and where I talk about Storygraph versus Goodreads, my feelings on both of those. I will list that down below. I do that video like every year in January or February, just kind of like reviewing my year in Goodreads and thinking about that. Something that's really nice about Storygraph is that you can make your own tags. You can do that in Goodreads as well, but it's not as intuitive and it's not as easy to look at. Storygraph, because they have and are known for all the graphs and charts, makes it much easier and much more accessible to make tags and then follow those tags, look at those tags, update them. And I made a tag for every book that made me tear up in the year of 2023 and every book that made me cry in the year of 2023. And I definitely think of tearing up could be like welling up or a couple of tears drop, but like the books that made me cry, like I cried. I cry fairly easily at books, so it's probably a lot compared to most people how many books made me cry this year. I thought it would be interesting to look back and see how many books made me cry this year and what those books were. For the tiered up category, I have 17 books, and for the cried category, I have 12 books. So let's do tiered up first and see what books those were. I don't think these are in any particular order, or at least I don't understand the order that they're in. So the first book that I see here is The Dark Descent of Elizabeth Frankenstein. And this is a Frankenstein retelling by Kirsten White, and it is all kind of told from Elizabeth's perspective, who was Frankenstein's adopted sister and later potential wife/love. I enjoyed this book. I didn't think it was amazing, but there was a couple of pages that really were sad because Frankenstein definitely has to do with like the loss of all the people close to Victor Frankenstein, and this one was a little bit even more, I think, intense in that depiction of loss. The next book that I teared up about was The Road from Karain, a woman's exquisitely clear-sighted memoir of growing up Australian by Jill Kerr Conway. This is a nonfiction I read for the BookTube Spin. This one just, again, is very like sad because Jill Kerr Conway's family, specifically her father and brothers, all die very tragically, and so there is a lot of emotions wrapped up in this. This one also is about Kerr Conway's love of the Australian plains and her description of having to leave that part of Australia and being separated from that land that she identifies so much was definitely very emotional. Next, I have Red Shirts. So the first two books I can definitely remember tearing up at. Red Shirts I don't remember tearing up at, except I think there was a part of Red Shirts where two people who have been separated, it becomes clear what happened to create that separation, and kind of both sides need that explanation. And I think that's probably the part I teared up about. Red Shirts is written by John Scalzi, and it is a little bit of an existential sci-fi about the idea that red shirts in Star Trek are expendable. Another book that I teared up at was 5 Carat Soul by James McBride. I don't remember tearing up at this short story collection either, except that I do know that some of the stories were about families and were about loss, so I'm sure that makes sense. Planned Occasion by Angie Kim was a short story that I got free from one of my subscriptions, and this one was just emotional. It's about an older woman who has to leave her home, is going into a like assisted living / nursing home, and it's about her last day in her house, her remembering all the things that happened in that house and all the emotional events that happen with her husband and her children. Foster by Claire Keegan is another one I definitely remember tearing up at. I didn't full on cry for this. There's a emotional moment between our main character and her aunt and uncle. I remember tearing up at that. The Joy Luck Club I remember tearing up on the very, very, very last page. The Joy Luck Club by Amy Tan is about mothers and daughters and immigrants from China and their children, the relationships between all of those women. And so one of the main storylines of the Joy Luck Club is that one of the mothers has passed away. So her daughter is expected to take on her role in this community. And the very last page, there are some like revelations that she has about her mother and about her mother's life. And I remember tearing up at that. The Death of Mrs. Westaway, I didn't even like that book. That's by Ruth Ware. It's a mystery. It was the second Ruth Ware I've ever read and the last Ruth Ware I plan on reading. And why did I tear up on that? Again, maybe it's because the main character's mother passes away tragically, so maybe there was a moment there that made me tear up, but I don't remember. The Vanishing Half by Britt Bennett was super, super popular on BookTube a few years ago, and I always kind of put off reading it, but I'm really glad that I read it this year. I read it way back in February of 2023, and I really enjoyed it. It's kind of a multiple narrative, multiple timeline story about two sisters who grow up in a really poor rural black town. They're both able to pass for white, and when they escape to the big city, one of them takes on the life of a white woman and one of them continues her life as a black woman, and it's about how their lives come together and diverge, and I definitely could see why I teared up at this one. The Bean Trees by Barbara Kingsolver I just read recently. This is another story of a young woman who lives in a very poor rural town, kind of escaping that life. She ends up unexpectedly adopting a child, and there's definitely some scenes with the child and with her and her realizations of what that child's life was like before they met that would make me tear up. Curiosity Thrilled the Cat I read for a Cat Cozy Mystery vlog, so I will leave that linked down below. This is by Sophie Kelly, and it's one of the few Cat Cozy Mystery books that I really, really enjoyed, and I want to continue on with the series. I don't remember what in this made me tear up at all. The Bullet That Missed by Richard Osman is the third in the Thursday Murder Club. This one is about senior citizens who solve mysteries, and so there's always someone getting old, dying, or having problems that senior citizens face, and it definitely could have been that made me tear up. Just Like Home by Sarah Gailey is a horror that is, I feel like, mostly forgettable, although I did like certain aspects of it. I think that the main theme is parental-child relationships, and as we know, those relationships definitely get to me sometimes, and I think that the horror aspect of this depicts those relationships in a specific way, and it's not so much that you might tear up at the mother-daughter relationship or father-daughter relationship, but I think the actual horror-daughter relationship is probably what made me tear up. The Door by Magda Szabo is a translated work that I'm very glad I read, but it was definitely the most frustrating and aggravating read that I've read this year. The relationship between the main character Magda and her on-again, off-again household help is very frustrating, and I swear I could have teared up from frustration alone, but I know that I teared up at a specific part in that relationship and towards the end of the book. Claire DeWitt and the City of the Dead I just read in December, and I already don't really remember why I teared up at it. There are some poignant moments, and there's definitely a lot of racial injustice in this book, so maybe I teared up because of something like that, but I'm not entirely sure. That was a reread for Remember December, and I read it specifically to try to remember what it was about and to see how I really felt about it, and I loved it. A Thousand Warnings Poems by Mary Oliver is the first Mary Oliver poetry collection that I've read, and I know exactly which poem that I teared up about. It's specifically about the loss of a dog. I mean, just the heartfelt emotions of losing a animal that you are close to will probably always make me tear up. Falling Bodies, which was another of those free short stories that I got from a subscription, and the second Rebecca Roanhorse book I've ever read, made me tear up. I remember why. That is about a father-son relationship, and it's about your own identity being lost to the point where you are not tethered to anything. I remember distinctly what made me tear up in that. So let's go back and see what I cried over. I only cried over 12 books. Right off the bat, Felix Ever After, that I really cried because the father-son relationship in Felix Ever After is very complex, but in the end, not in the end of the book, but in the end of the whole, like, in conclusion of the relation, well, that's not a good way to say it either. The overarching emotion of that relationship is love and acceptance, and so I definitely cried in that. I cried at Memorial by Brian Washington. That I don't really remember exactly why I cried. There is a father-mother relationship and a father-son relationship in that are both very emotional at times. I cried in As You Wish, Inconceivable Tales of the Making of the Princess Bride. I know that I cried at the very end of this book when Carrie Elwes is talking about how much that movie meant to people and how much the cast and crew understood that it was a super special movie. And even though they felt all the emotion about the movie, and even though they had this magical experience, they didn't realize that it would translate to being so magical for so many viewers, and that so many people would fall in love with that movie, and it would be like a very significant movie in their lives, and it was just like an emotional passage, and I cried at that. The Prince and the Dressmaker by Jen Wong. I cried at a father-daughter, father-son relationship. Just the accepting nature of parents to their queer children is something that like always makes me cry, always makes me tear up, and I just love, I think especially when a father like accepts and understands their queer child, just touches my heart, always makes me cry. Happy tears, sad tears, all sorts of good things. Rogue Protocol by Martha Wells, which is the third in the Murderbot series, made me cry. I know exactly when I cried in that as well, and it is the loss of one specific character. Other Words for Home by Jasmine Warga. This is a middle grade book written in verse, and I think I cried at a sister-brother relationship in this, and just kind of the separation from your family and the sweet, sad nature of families in general. An American Marriage by Terry Jones. I don't remember the exact moment that I cried in this, but there was a lot of, again, that separation and growing apart. I think the way that this book is written, you can really see relationships that you've had, whether those were romantic relationships or familial relationships, in that story, and it is an emotional story across the board, for sure. Peking Story, The Last Days of Old China by David King is a nonfiction book. This one has a lot to do with David King's family that he met and became part of in China. He met his wife there and they married, and I know that the part that I cried at was just how King was completely destroyed by the new regime moving in, and how all the history both of the landscape and the family were destroyed by these outside forces that really didn't care about preserving any sort of tradition or historical lifestyles. Darius the Great is Not Okay. I definitely cried at because of the father-son relationship. That one is by Adib Karam, and I definitely want to read the second in that series. Toting the Sweep by Angela Johnson. I think I cried at this one because it's all about a grandmother having to leave her life and having to leave her lifestyle and having to leave her home in Arizona and move in with her daughter and her granddaughter. And I think this one made me cry because of that idea of like having to leave the place that you love, and even though you love your family that you're moving in with, difficult mother-daughter relationships are going to be a hardship, and you're leaving this place that you love and wish that you could stay at. I cried almost the entire way through Honey Girl. I read that one fairly recently. This is Morgan Rogers' debut novel. It reminded me a lot of Weetzie Bat. I did enjoy Honey Girl. I didn't love Honey Girl, but something about it feeling like Weetzie Bat, something about the queer love story, something about the queer found family, something about the father-daughter relationship just made me so emotional this entire book. It just made me cry almost the entire way through. And I think that like overwhelming nostalgic feeling is really what got me. Finally, the last book that so far that I cried at in 2023, we still have a couple weeks left, so I might cry at a few more books. We'll see, is Malibu Rising by Taylor Jenkins Reid. This is the second Taylor Jenkins Reid novel that I read. I really liked The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo, and I cried at that book as well. I don't remember what exactly I cried at Malibu Rising, but I remember there being a couple of like emotional scenes with the siblings and a couple of shocking scenes that I definitely might have cried at. So those were the 29 books that I either teared up about or totally cried about in 2023. Let me know, do books make you cry? Let me know one book that made you cry this year. Thanks so much for joining me today, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!